terrorism, economic warfare, political spin, clandestine operations. Unredacted with Rachel Marsden, lifting the black ink to reveal the covert information and intelligence around global events. And now, here is your host, Rachel Marsden.
How you doing, everyone? Get in here. We're about to get going. We're not going to waste any time today. We'll get straight into it. Got a lot to talk about today. French presidential elections, war in Ukraine. Those are the two big ones. A lot of other news going on too today. Did you know that COVID has a grip on Shanghai? And Shanghai had everybody on lockdown, but it looks like they're already easing up despite the fact that it's not going away. So what the heck is going on in China with COVID again? It's that BA2 variant that we keep hearing about. I also was reading earlier today that apparently there might be a whole COVID wave, COVID tsunami besieging the United States of America, and nobody knows about it. Is that even a problem then? If a COVID falls in a forest and nobody hears it, doesn't make a sound, does it exist? We're now into the philosophical phase of the pandemic. All right, so welcome to the show, everyone. Get on in here. I know that the stream just started, so I want to give everybody a chance to come in before I bring my guest on. That's why I like to give about 10 minutes prior to the guest coming on. We have a great guest for you today from Moscow. Xavier Moreau, French former military officer who has been based in Moscow for many years now as a businessman and a political analyst. And he has a very unique perspective on the political aspect and military aspects of the conflict in Ukraine. So he is going to come on with us at the top of the hour. Stick with us. In the meantime, I want to talk about the French presidential election. 2 rounds of voting. First round just finished yesterday. Can you believe that the polls closed at 8 p.m. in France? And we had the results. Give or take a little bit of adjustment. We had the results at 8 p.m. Literally, you're watching the news channel, and at 10 seconds to 8 p.m., when the polls close, you get a countdown, big flashing countdown, 10, 9, 8, 7, 6. And then when they get to 0, they give you the results. Boom, right up on the screen. At the time the polls close. Has to do with exit polling. It's very accurate and everybody relies on it. But despite the minor adjustments that occur when the votes actually are counted and the exit poll being pretty accurate with respect to that final count, there risked being a surprise in the French election. So the final 2 candidates out of the whole pack of them that ran in the first round of voting, the final 2 candidates up for president of France in 2 weeks are incumbent Emmanuel Macron of the bourgeoisie. Let's face it, that's what he is. He's kind of an interesting character. Emmanuel Macron, current president of France, is a globalist. He flat out says he's all about pro-European, greater integration, greater role of Europe in the world. He likes to talk about European sovereignty, more so than French sovereignty even. He does kind of couch his globalist rhetoric in talk of intelligent globalization. Whatever that is, he hasn't done it. And he was Minister of Economic and Digital Affairs. Economics and digital transition are the two of the big planks of the Great Reset. Klaus Schwab, Davos, World Economic Forum's Great Reset. Emmanuel Macron was the minister of those 2 areas during Socialist President François Hollande's mandate, his single 5-year mandate. And Macron left before the end of the mandate specifically to mount a run for the presidency, which he was able to win. He created his own party, got donations from left and right, and got votes and support from establishment politicians from the left and the right. It was a marriage of convenience. And it gave the impression of an outlier, of a startup, of somebody who didn't fit the establishment mold, and yet he fell right into with the establishment ethos and thinking. So that's who we have up in the last round of voting in 2 weeks against Marine Le Pen, the far right candidate perpetually who makes it to the last round of voting and ultimately loses. Now, let me explain something. I don't know where you guys are weighing in from. Tell me in the chat, please. By the way, you can chat with me at any time during the show. So, and I always love your feedback. And if it's really good, I'll throw it up on the screen, especially when my guest is on, if you have a question for my guest. So tell me where you're from in the chat. And I'll tell you, I'll try to explain to you based on your political compass of where you are geographically, what far right means in the French context. No, it does not mean Donald Trump or the Oath Keepers or anything like that if you're in the US. Far right in France is an odd mix. It's not free market limited government. That's the conventional, it's actually in French, free market limited government is called la droite libérale, the liberal right. Get your head around that, or try to get your head around that if you're in the US, what liberal right means. It means liberal in the trading sense and right wing in the political ideology sense. So that's the conventional right. That is Valérie Pécresse, who in the first round of presidential voting didn't even score 5% and now has a 10 million euro debt, 5 million of which is to her name, because you need 5% of the vote in order to get it refunded by the state. I don't think she was counting on that. So anyway, Marine Le Pen, who was about 4 points behind Emmanuel Macron in this first round of voting, she's of the French far right, which basically is an interesting combination of left-wing economics, social security economics, and right-wing on immigration. And what happened is, if you think this was an election that had to do with the classic, traditional, 2-decade-old, maybe even longer, right-left paradigm that we've seen in every other election everywhere else in the world, that would be wrong. Because what this election was about, it was more anti-establishment versus establishment. And the big surprise in this first round of voting, and I kind of predicted it in a column you can read at rachelmarsden.com. If you go to the bottom section of the first page of the site, you'll be able to see a column I wrote last week about how this election is exactly about anti-establishment versus establishment candidates. And in the anti-establishment realm, we have Marine Le Pen and the far left, Jean-Luc Mélenchon of La France Insoumise. So unsubmitted or unsubmissible France is what it means. He almost beat Marine Le Pen to make it into the second round. His score exploded in the last few days of the election. Now, the Socialist Party, the conventional Socialist Party, I think Anne Hidalgo, the mayor of Paris, she came 7th in Paris in this election. Well, Paris is turning into more and more of a trash heap every day, so it's not surprising that the Parisians didn't vote for her. But she got, I think, 1.6, not even 2% in the whole country, and she's the traditional socialist candidate. The French went far right and far left. Unconventional, Unestablishment parties. But what happened, what's really interesting is Jean-Luc Mélenchon, the far left candidate, despite getting like 20%, almost 21% of the vote, and almost beating Marine Le Pen, I think he might have even gotten a little bit more than that. But anyway, it was really close. He said in his speech after the election, after the vote, when every candidate takes the stage at their campaign parties and they can talk about whatever they want, they can also instruct their voters, if they didn't make it to the second round, to vote for someone else. They can say, look, I want you to support, thanks for your vote, I want you to support this person. Now, I was thinking it would be really wise, knowing that there is an anti-establishment sentiment in France that is everyone but Macron kind of mentality of voters. It would be smart for the far left and the far right to make a populist coalition, and for Mélenchon of the far left to throw his support, to throw the weight of his 20 some odd percent of the first round votes behind Marine Le Pen as a fellow populist, as a fellow non-establishment candidate, to counter Macron. But of course, what did he do? The opposite. He gets up and he says, everybody, you can't give Marine Le Pen a single vote, you got to vote Macron. Oh, so Mr. Man of the People, Mr. I'm all for the workers, power to the, to the working man, who basically sat on his ass while Macron and his government were imposing vaccine mandates for COVID on all sorts of workers as a condition of their employment, totally leaving aside any option of choice. Sat on his hands for that. Also didn't have a lot to say when the Macron government was taking shots at people during every Saturday for about 2 years during the Yellow Vest protests, taking people's eyes out with rubber bullets. I mean, a lot of violence in the streets against protesters during the Yellow Vest movement. He sat on his hands for that. Everything that he could have done to support workers' rights during the COVID pandemic, to push back on some of these mandates and restrictions. Instead, he took the position of, we're going to have some labor protests, but a little later. So what has he done to defend the common working man? And now he's literally telling people to vote for the candidate of the French bourgeoisie, Mr. Globalist himself. All because they have this thing in France called the Republican Front, le Front Républicain, which basically means everybody who isn't the far right has to vote against the far right to prevent them from getting in. It's called the Republican Front. In other words, everybody who doesn't like them has to vote against them. So that's exactly what we're looking at in the second round of voting. So it's a bit anticlimactic. And I don't know who these people are who are voting against their own interests constantly. By the way, the abstention rate in this election was like a quarter of the voting population, which is pretty high. So between the quarter of the people approximately who voted for Macron and the other quarter of the voting population who abstained, half the voting population in France, I don't know, doesn't give a crap, or is oblivious, or is just following the bouncing ball day to day. So what do you guys think? I'm seeing some of your comments here. Is Marine Le Pen racist? I've met her. She didn't seem racist to me. Her policies don't seem racist. In fact, she flat out said in a recent interview that she's against discrimination because she understands what discrimination is, because her father, who arguably could be considered a racist, and she's not her father, we're responsible for what our parents do. None of us are. She said, I had to go to school with the last name Le Pen, and I was treated horribly because of it. She says, far be it for me to judge somebody or prejudge somebody or be prejudiced against somebody because of something they can't help. That was her position. And I know people who have worked with Marine Le Pen, and they flat out say there's nothing racist about her at all. So what about Mélenchon? I see a question that one of the chatters has thrown up here. Yeah, Mélenchon is far left, and he's just told all of his 20 some odd % of voters in the first round that he rallied up to go vote for Macron, Mr. Man of the people, power to the workers. Yeah. The media is with Macron for sure. I mean, what do you expect when the government gives out subsidies and funding to French media in huge amounts, and when the French media is all owned by 3 billionaires who are close to power? I mean, I don't think it's necessarily a case of people of the government telling the media what they need to say. It's a case of people in the media knowing on which side their bread's buttered. In a lot of cases, a lot of self-censorship happening, a lot of people who understand the way their superiors think and are not too willing to test the parameters. That's kind of what's going on. Yes, blue collar workers. I see. Thank you for the question here, chatter. Blue collars are more inclined to vote Le Pen. Yes. And yet Mélenchon, who could have made a coalition with her to beat Macron and to get him out, who's the candidate of the bourgeoisie, no question, he didn't. Which leads me to believe, I mean, I've always suspected, I mean, I can tell you a little incident that was very instructive to me. When I first moved to France, so I moved here in 2008. And maybe about a year later, Sarkozy was in power. And he had a spokesperson working with him at the Élysée. And he invited me to lunch one day to Fouquet's, which is kind of like the Élysée Palace cafeteria across the street from kind of down the street and across the street on the Champs-Élysées. He invited me to lunch there. So we walk in. He goes around in front of me and he shakes hands with pretty much everybody at every table. He knew everyone there. And I said to him, I said, how is it that you know everyone? Who are these people? He says, that's the head of such and such a labor union. That guy over there is the head of this other labor union. That guy over there is a huge vice president of some big firm. This guy over there is the head of another labor. And I said, so everybody gets along? Like, you got the big businessman meeting with the head of the labor unions. You got the right and the left all just hanging out, having a good laugh over lunch. He said, yeah. In fact, I came from the left, and now I'm the spokesman for Nicolas Sarkozy. It's a real cozy environment, and it's not like in the US where it's very polarized. You don't get that same sense. You get a sense, and this is what I'm getting at. You get a sense that everybody is playing a role publicly, and that behind the scenes, there's a lot more going on that we're not seeing. It's like the duck on the surface of the water with the feet going a million miles an hour, and it just looks so smooth, right? Everybody's playing their role. Everybody's saying the right things in public. And behind the scenes, they're making deals. So I'm wondering, what's the deal with Mélenchon, who's supposed to be Mr. Man of the People? It would be like the way he talks. It'd be like if Che Guevara made a deal with John F. Kennedy. Kennedy being Macron, which is actually kind of a crappy comparison given that Macron could not fill JFK's shoes. But, you know, they have that same aura, right? Chatter, I see your question. What does Marine Le Pen think of the EU and NATO? That's an interesting one. Her position has evolved on the EU. She initially was flirting with the idea of taking France out of the EU, and now her position is more sovereignty for France within the EU. Critics who are pro-sovereignty, pro-Frexit, say it's impossible what she's asking for because in order to gain sovereignty for France, you have to leave the EU. She's talking more about reforming EU rules so that France and other countries within it have more flexibility within the union. Because as we've seen, particularly with this situation of the conflict in Ukraine, the EU passes rules and it's top down. It's just imposed on everyone, just right. So what does she think of NATO? Out, out, out. She wants France out of NATO. So does Mélenchon, by the way. So they have a lot in common, which really blows my mind when it's just all about demagoguery. It's all about ideology. And it's almost like Mélenchon either doesn't want to see the reality of this election, or he has interests that prevent him from seeing the reality of this election, that it isn't right and left anymore. It's about anti-establishment versus establishment. And he's going to screw everybody who didn't vote for Macron, which is a lot of people, if he gets in again. And it looks like he just might, barring something. Well, let me tell you something else. So there's 2 rounds of voting, first round, second round. Between the 2 rounds, there's 2 weeks and there's a presidential debate. So Macron and Le Pen will be debating each other. This is where she really screwed herself in the last election in 2017. She was doing pretty well until she got to the debate with Macron. But I also know from talking to people who were involved in her campaign, and I'm talking people who worked with her, that she wasn't interested in really working her economic knowledge and really wrapping her head around some really complex problematics. And that's where she really lost it in the debate. I think she shored up on that. I think she's going to be in a much better position. But we'll see. The French put a lot of stock in the debate. Putin must like her. Why? Because I'm reading a chatter's comment. Putin must like Marine Le Pen. I think, to be honest, as somebody who sat in front of Vladimir Putin in the same room in Moscow for hours on end, every time he gives one of his annual press conferences, to which I've been many times, just before Christmas every year, he talks for hours and about pretty much anything and everything that the Russian media is throwing at him. We in the foreign press are in the extreme minority of these events. I actually got to ask a question, which was great. I asked him about Syria, and during the Syrian war, Trump was basically telling everybody that Syria is over, we're done, we're leaving, we're going to leave it in Turkey's hands. And ISIS is pretty much wiped out. And Putin said, Trump is right. And of course, CNN picks it up, they take a shot at me, and they put it on the bottom of the screen, Putin says Trump's right. It's like, he said he was right about ISIS being wiped out, but it wasn't just Trump's right, like generally speaking. It's funny how things get twisted around. But I get the impression from sitting in front of Putin for hours on end that Vladimir Putin just wants every country to run itself and to be accountable to the people of that country, and to not be looking elsewhere to see what other countries they could screw over in order to serve some other interests that really have nothing to do with those of the average citizen in that country. He's about sovereignty. He sounds very Reagan-esque. That's the best description. It's a description that kept coming back. He even quoted Ronald Reagan during press conferences. Like, I think he's a student of Ronald Reagan. I haven't had the chance to ask him that, but does Putin like her? I think he appreciates her perspective with respect to French sovereignty, the primacy of French sovereignty. But thank you for your question. That's actually a pretty good one. Yeah. So let me just tell you where we're going, because my guest should be coming on any minute. I don't know where he is. He's not here yet. But if he doesn't show up, we will keep going. But tomorrow, I want to tell you who we're going to have on. Drum roll. This is going to be interesting. On tomorrow's show, we're going to have on Jack Devine, who is the former director of operations of the Central Intelligence Agency of the CIA. He introduced the Stinger missile into Afghanistan. And we're talking about stingers again now in the context of Ukraine. So, given that he had a very prominent role in the covert war with the Mujahideen against the Soviets back in the 80s, that he has that rapport with the Soviet Union, given that he basically fought them in that proxy war and led it as director of operations for the CIA. We're going to have him on tomorrow to talk about what he thinks of this proxy war, how he feels about how things have evolved since that proxy war. And given that he was the director of operations of the CIA, he has some really unique insight. And I know that I've talked to him many times, and not on this particular show, which has only been going for about a month now, but not even. But in previous instances, I've talked to Jack Devine, and he has a very unique view of a very objective view of Russia and Russians, and has very good rapport with people in Russia. So it'll be interesting to see what he has to say about it. So tomorrow, you're not going to want to miss the show. Jack Devine, former director of operations for the Central Intelligence Agency, on to talk about the Ukraine war. Yeah, one of the chatters here, I'm going to throw this comment up because it's worth talking about. We're just going to keep going if that's okay with you guys, because my guest has not logged on yet. I don't know where he is. He's supposed to be in Moscow. So maybe he got the time wrong or something. I don't know. I confirmed this morning, but we're just going to keep going. All right. So thank you, chatter, for your question. It doesn't matter who likes her or not, Le Pen, as long as the people of France like her. Yeah, exactly. The globalists put aside the interests of their own people while corporations with their profit put first place. Yeah. I mean, I think it goes even beyond corporations, politicians trying to pander to corporations. I think it goes to political leaders essentially trying to serve special interests that are more narrow than just general corporate interests. Because if it was just general corporate interests, you could argue that that could be beneficial to the people if those corporations, if the policies in place in the country are sound enough to provide adequate benefit to the people. That sounds a bit trickle down, but it is true. I mean, corporations do employ people, right? And they do take risks to do that. So I don't think it's completely out of line for politicians to keep those corporate interests at the forefront of their agenda. But I think it goes to, I mean, climate change, for example, just to take a really concrete example of what I'm talking about. With climate change, you have to ask yourself, are there really a lot of companies in the United States or in any country for that matter who are heavy industrial hitters in the climate change business? Not really. How many people work in the climate change sector or energetic transition sector or power transition sector? Not that many. Which means there's something else going on behind it. And that's what's a little more interesting. Yeah, special interest groups as one of, thanks, Chatter, exactly. All right, so if you guys have any questions, please feel free to send them through. My guest still isn't here, so we're gonna keep going. So just so you know as well, this week we're going to have today's show, tomorrow's show. Afterwards, I'm not too sure. I'm then taking a little bit of time off, so we might be gone for a few weeks, probably back in May. But I'll keep you guys posted. You can go to the Twitter account, UNREDACTED Show, and I'll keep you posted as to what's going on. But some of you are signed up. If you're not on YouTube, you can sign up for the live event. There's some other things going on right now that I want to talk about. Here's an interesting. Let me just load it up. This is all right. So we know that the West is peddling peddling weapons to Ukraine. I'm assuming that the taxpayers of the Western countries are paying for them. The US defense budget was just jammed full of pork in order to pay for them. So, how exactly is that supposed to promote peace? Do you guys buy the argument that the best way to achieve peace in Ukraine is to arm Ukraine to the teeth so they can keep fighting Russia? Or is the best way to achieve peace in Ukraine to stop flooding the country with weapons so that they have no choice but to talk to each other? And yes, I know Russia has weapons. Russia also has nukes. So if we're going to try to outgun Russia, that can't lead anywhere good, I don't think. Unless we just want to go straight into nuclear war. Is that where we're going? If we're not going there, because that would be the logical conclusion of this whole arms race in Ukraine to outgun Russia, then why don't we just stop sending weapons there? If the goal is peace and negotiation and a treaty, then why do we keep doing that? But given that, here's something interesting that I found. Associated Press title: China makes semi-secret delivery of missiles to Serbia. Russian ally Serbia. Yeah, I wonder. Let me just stop right there. Russian ally Serbia. Wonder why it's an ally of Russia. Yes, there's the Orthodox Church and there are links, etc. But remember what NATO did in Yugoslavia? Raised holy hell in Yugoslavia, bombed the shit out of Belgrade, and ultimately caused Serbia to hate everything Western as a result of that. And again, that was because Kosovo was loaded up with Western fighters, proxy fighters, kind of like the Azov battalion is being used right now in Ukraine to fight the Serbs who were backed by Russia. This was kind of like one of the corollaries of the end of the Cold War. I feel like the Cold War, in retrospect, hasn't really ended anymore. It's like, did it really end? All right, so Russian ally Serbia took the delivery of a sophisticated Chinese anti-aircraft system in a veiled operation this weekend, amid Western concerns that an arms buildup in the Balkans at the time of the war in Ukraine could threaten the fragile peace in the region. Is this for real? Amid Western concerns that an arms buildup in the Balkans at the time of the war in Ukraine, where they're building up arms, right? Should we put that in there? Could threaten the fragile peace in the region. That's exactly what they're doing in Ukraine. What the heck is going on? So media and military experts say Sunday that 6 Chinese Air Force Y-20 transport planes landed at Belgrade's civilian airport early Saturday, reportedly carrying HQ-22 surface-to-air missile systems for the Serbian military. Yeah. I bet people had no idea that China had anti-aircraft systems. Are those the ones whose blueprints they stole? You know, it's pretty funny. I got to tell you guys a little story here. There are a lot of national security and defense conferences in France, given that France is a huge military power, right? So there's a conference every couple of years called Millipol, and it's where countries from all over the world come to a big conference hall not far from Charles de Gaulle Airport, and huge convention hall, and each country kind of sets up their military defense stand. And and the Chinese, every stand from every country had a lot of people around it. And the Chinese stand didn't have that many. And this is 10 years ago, maybe a little bit less, perhaps. Chinese stand didn't have that many people. So I asked one of my friends who was there from a Western, he's a retiree from a Western paramilitary organization. I said, why do you think there is nobody at the Chinese stand? And he said, because people don't want to buy Chinese weapons or radar, or he says, and the reason being is that you buy a radar platform from China and it breaks down and there's no after sales service. So you need to buy a few more, and pretty soon you've just got a pile of them and they're all broken. Apparently, after sales service is super important in military acquisitions, in arms sales. There was also, I met a gentleman there from Iran who came up to the American, the American area, because it's not like America just had a stand at the military convention in France. They had a whole pavilion with a bunch of little stands in it. And this Iranian guy came up to one of the stands where one of my friends was working, and he said, I want to buy drones. And the guy at the stand, my friend, says, where are you from? And he goes, I'm from the Republic of Iran. And he had his business card and everything. And he goes, but you guys are under sanctions? And he goes, sanctions are not a problem for us. So here we go. Chinese weapons have apparently made a comeback, and the West is very concerned about weapons going into the Balkans in a place where it could threaten the fragile peace of the region, whereas they're literally sending weapons to Ukraine where there is a conflict, an armed conflict. So why don't they just stop that already? All right, so that's another thing going on here. Let me just, there's something else that I wanted to talk to you guys about, because there's a lot of stuff happening in the media right now. Did you guys see that Boris Johnson from the UK, Prime Minister of the UK, made his way over to Kiev, made a pit stop, what is it, a whistle stop to Kiev, and shook hands with Zelensky. Everybody's getting in their photo op. It's like he's like the new Bono or something. Like everybody was shaking hands with him. I don't know. I mean, have you ever seen anybody trying to command? I presume, because okay, this is something fishy, right? You're the prime minister of a country that is in the middle of a major conflict. You got time to shake hands with all these people and do photo ops. Who's running the show? I mean, I don't see Vladimir Putin running around and doing photo ops, and he's the, like, I don't know, he's the president of Russia. You'd think he'd be doing a lot more of that, but I would like somebody to actually do a tally of the photo ops that Zelensky has done versus the photo ops that Putin has done since the beginning of this conflict. See who's actually sitting out at their desk doing the work. Here's the other weird thing. I keep talking about war crimes, right? On both sides. It's a war, right? It's a war. War is a crime. At some point, I know there are rules of war, and I know that there's certain protocol that exists to prevent total annihilation, which is why, for example, the Russians and the Americans are communicating with each other with respect to flyovers and things like that over Ukraine to prevent a misunderstanding. I mean, this is what happens in war. There are certain protocols that have to, it's not just, well, we hate those guys, we're fighting them, and they're fighting our guys, or whatever. There are protocols that have to be followed. So you also can go after on the battlefield unlawful enemy combatants. That was the whole argument with Gitmo, right? Like when when the United States caught jihadists in the middle of the desert and sent them to Gitmo, it became an issue of, well, you know, can you torture them? Are you allowed to waterboard them? Is that torture? Why aren't they treated like prisoners of war? And the argument was that, well, since the Peace of Westphalia, if you don't have an insignia and you're not on the battlefield designated as a member of an armed force, then you can literally be shot on sight. You can be waterboarded. You can do whatever the heck you want. And then, of course, a bunch of libs went, oh no, but war has evolved since then. And now jihadists have to be treated like they are fighters, like a party to a conflict, treated like soldiers. Yeah, right. Well, in this conflict with Ukraine, there's a lot of fog of war, right? Von Clausewitz, fog of war. So we're relying on images that can be misrepresented, taken out of context. We don't know really what is happening in terms of who's responsible for what, for sure. Even the Pentagon is iffy on some of the things that have been cited as fact by some journalists and who are essentially just taking one government spokesperson or official's word for it and adopting as fact because I guess it sounds good. But there hasn't been any independent investigations with respect to some of these incidents that look bad in war. And they're bound to happen. It's war, right? So these things have to be looked into. Now, there's long been this entity in place, the Hague, right? The International Criminal Court in The Hague. And there's a deliberate desire on the part of the Biden administration to see, they don't talk much about any kind of potential responsibility or attribution of responsibility of these instances. Instead, they're starting at the conclusion. They're saying, we are starting at the assumption that Vladimir Putin, not even Russian military or generals, whatever, we're starting at the conclusion that Vladimir Putin is responsible for this stuff. Forget the investigation. They're not demanding an investigation. They're demanding that he be brought to justice at The Hague. And they're saying there's a problem here because Biden administration really wants to help that occur. But problem, the United States has long taken the position that they want nothing to do with The Hague. Why? Because imagine if you opened that Pandora's box. Imagine what would happen with American soldiers, American generals, American presidents. If you open the war crimes Pandora's box because the United States was suddenly playing ball at The Hague. So what they're trying to do now is position themselves so that they can push along an objective of screwing over Vladimir Putin or nailing Vladimir Putin with an attribution of atrocities that hasn't even been made yet by an independent entity, while at the same time hoping that The Hague doesn't open the kimono on any of the other stuff that the Americans have been involved with over decades. That's a little bit hypocritical, but is anybody surprised? All right, so Jenny, I love your comment here. All right, I was talking about how the jihadists caught on the battlefield during the Iraq and Afghanistan wars in the early aughts, how you could literally just shoot them on sight or torture them or do whatever you want according to the laws of warfare because they don't actually have proper uniforms and insignia. And Jenny said, that's not a good argument, Rachel. These Taliban don't have the budget for uniforms or F-16s. They wear flip-flops. So if you don't have the budget, you can argue that, I guess. I mean, can you imagine how many people could get away with stuff if they could just argue that, look, I wanted to, our military, you could literally classify a whole military under that category and say, look, you can't touch our guys. They're not in uniform. And the reason being is we just don't have the money this year. So maybe next year, but hey, they're real, they're legit. So don't touch them. All right. So, yeah, one of the chatters here saying, all US officials will be tried for war crimes. Well, no, but that's the whole thing. They want to cause the Hague to go after Vladimir Putin for stuff that hasn't been attributed in Ukraine yet, while at the same time making sure that that doesn't happen to them. So they're walking a fine line. They might have to go through a proxy for that too, just like they don't want to confront Russia directly. So they go through the Ukrainian army proxy and the Azov battalion neo-Nazi proxies, because if they were to frontally get into a conflict with Russia themselves, it would be a disaster. So that's probably what they'll do at The Hague too. They'll probably tell some other country to do their bidding for them. And they'll probably do it because it'll probably be, I don't know, some promise made behind the scenes that if you do this, a quid pro quo, right? Do this for us, we'll do that for you. All right, so I'm reading a comment here, chatter. You are making a horrible mistake assuming that the president Ukraine is a civilized democratic country. In reality, with rising Nazi becoming a barbarian Stone Age stage with animals instead of people. Well, we do know for sure that there are significant, and we've covered that extensively on this show, extensive neo-Nazi elements within the fighting forces currently in Ukraine. And is Ukraine a democracy? It's an oligarchy. It's run by a bunch of oligarchs. So I don't know how far you can take that, really. It's always been kind of a shit show. That's a very technical political science term, a shit show. Okay, so it looks like my guest is screwed, but hey, we're having a good time, right? What else is on your mind? If you guys have a topic that you've come across in the news you want me to comment on, sometimes I can give you a bit of a perspective that sitting here in Europe and having spent a lot of time in Moscow, having spent a lot of time pretty much on every continent except Asia, might be able to enlighten you a bit. So, of course, don't hesitate to fire off any questions. But I see that yeah. I see that Donald Trump is back in the news. Looks like they're not going to let up on him, right? That January 6th commission. I think it looks like he's supporting Dr. Oz now. Dr. Oz is running for office, I guess, in November. Trump endorsed Dr. Oz for the Republican U.S. Senate primary race in Pennsylvania. What? What? I feel like when I hear Dr. Oz is running for the U.S. Senate in Pennsylvania, Donald Trump is backing him, and Elon Musk is like going to go to Mars, and you got the Amazon guy who's shooting his rocket into space. I feel like I just woke up from a bad dream, and some fragments of knowledge are just kind of rattling around in my head because these things should not connect at all. All right. So, Jenny, you bring up a really interesting question here, chatter. John McCain, yeah. Yeah. Jenny's saying in chat that the Azov battalion neo-Nazis or Nazis. Is it neo-Nazi or Nazi? What's the difference? How do you determine if you're a neo-Nazi or if you're just a Nazi? Or are they all gone now? But anyway, we'll sing like John McCain to get out of a death sentence when captured. Yeah, captured by Russian soldiers, I guess. Here's something that's really interesting. I don't know how many of you guys are on Telegram, but there are official channels on Telegram coming out of Russia. And I read Cyrillic. I have a B2 level ability to speak and read and understand Russian. It's not fully fluent. I mean, I'm a B2 C1 level. C2 is fully fluent. That's English and French for me. But in Russian, B2, C1. So I follow some of these channels because since everything's censored coming out of Russian media platforms, we're not really getting a very objective view And I don't even care if it's objective. I just want to know what they think over there, what their perspective is on this. I don't need the EU to say, we don't want you to see that because it's disinformation or misinformation. Screw you. I know that the stuff that you're putting in front of my face is spun. I know that you're selecting, you're cherry picking information that you're giving me. I know that when I see 10 million articles about the ghost of Kiev shooting down Russian planes left and right, that and I look at a stupid picture and it's out of a video game and you don't correct it, that it's not legit. I know when you tell me that Snake Island, these brave soldiers on Snake Island said, F you, Russian warship. And then the Russian warship opened fire on them and they all died. And now they're going to, Zelensky says he's going to give them posthumous medals. You know, the Zelensky gave one of those dudes a medal while he was alive, because that never freaking happened. But he gave them the medal anyway, because I guess he assumed they'd be dead and they weren't. So I guess he still had to follow through with the promise. But when I see stories like that aren't retracted, that just, they just float on by through the news cycle and everyone just keeps going and and some people may think that actually still did happen without realizing that it was bunk. When I see that, it's like, why can the Russian side, with their half of the narrative, their side of the story, why can't they get that in front of people too? Why does that have to be censored completely, like the EU did, like the US did to a certain extent by pressuring the carriers of RT America to not carry it? What's the panic? So instead, if you don't have a VPN, you can go to Telegram and you can follow some some official Russian channels, and you get their side of it. And I mean, none of this stuff all has to be verified with other sources, but at least it's a data point. And you take the data point and you compare it with other data points and you see if they line up. You see if other accounts line up, and that's how you assess information. So what's interesting is that I'm seeing on the Russian side that it's almost like there are two different wars going on when you read the two accounts. They're so drastically different. It's like you see that there are surrenders of Ukraine army to the Russians in the east. You see that they're laying down weapons. You see they're capturing. You see that they're blowing up weapons depots. And yet in the West, all you're hearing is, Slava Ukraini, and it's almost like there are two different wars. So speaking of John McCain, another chatter has just brought up John McCain again. He was a good friend of Ukraine too, wasn't he? He spent a lot of time drumming up trouble in Ukraine, him and Lindsey Graham, the two Republican neocons who never met a war that they didn't like. John McCain being the senator from Arizona who took a lot of special interest money from weapons manufacturers, who of course was wined and dined and seduced by them because he was on the armed services committee, I guess. So I guess he would be a prime target for special interest groups. And he fell right into it. He sung from the hymn book. So, and he spent a lot of time over in Ukraine during Maidan and prior to Maidan. And I mean, this is not something that popped off on February 24th. But it's amazing how many people think that. I mean, when you guys look around and you talk to people in your entourage, do you find that people get the idea that the situation in Ukraine just came off as a result of the Russians just waking up one day and going, we need to invade Ukraine? They think it started there and that there was no history. All right, so one of the chatters here is saying the only worries of 90% of Russians I put this up because it's a good one. It's a good point. There we go. Why isn't it going up on the screen? It's frozen. Let me try that again. All right, so yeah. How do politicians justify this double dealing and hypocrisy? Well, if nobody holds them account, they just keep going. All right, so Alexander, thanks for your question or point here. It's a good one. The only worries of 90% of Russians, 80% of Ukrainians, that the operation will not end till the aim is accomplished till the end. Full capitulation and denazification, the last one takes 5 to 10 years. Denazification taking 5 to 10 years? I don't know. I mean, all I know is that what's happening right now is both countries seem to be focusing on the next battle, which is in the east and south, and it looks as though all of the resources are going over there. So I would assume that would mean all of the proxy fighters, the Azov battalion, the right sector, all of the those guys have been integrated into the Ukrainian military. They're no longer like freelancers. They were trained by Western interests, including Canada, by the way. That's under investigation by the Canadian Department of Defense. Too little, too late, I think. They announced that last November. It's like, well, how do we know that these guys were neo-Nazis? They only had freaking swastikas on their arms. We didn't know. We just thought we were training Ukrainians, average Ukrainian guys. So no, they're folded in. They have the insignia. They're protected now and everything. It's the foreign fighters who read about the war on Reddit, or the Ukrainian situation on Reddit, and heard from the Ukrainian defense minister and from Zelensky that it was open bar for everybody from all over the world to come and help Ukraine fight the Russians. And a bunch of guys actually did it and got there and realized that it was a little bit more complex than playing Call of Duty. Oh, here's another one. There's a French war reporter who's done a lot of work for Paris Match, whose name is Régis Le Sommier. And he said on French TV a couple of days ago, he was over in Ukraine, and he said what he noticed when he was over there is that he had actually accompanied some foreign fighters who were trying to integrate into the Ukrainian fighting forces. And he said what was shocking to him is that they weren't met by Ukrainian officers, they were met by Americans. And one American said, "It's me in charge here, so you guys answer to me." Which kind of, that's interesting because up until now we had Joe Biden, who we don't know whether or not the things that come out of his mouth are facts or if he's misspeaking these days. It's hard to tell, but at one point he made a reference to soldiers, some battalion being over there, some American battalion being over in Ukraine. Everybody thought, oh, that's just Brandon, that's just Joe Brandon saying all his goofy shit. Turns out that Régis Le Sommier, when he went over there with the foreign fighters, that French journalist, he said, no, I mean, we were met by an American officer who pulled rank and said, everybody answers to me here. So what the heck is going on there? That's something that I'd like to dive into a little bit more. I'd like to know more about that. How much are the foreign fighters making over there? There were so many in the early days of the war. It's like swear some guys on Reddit just jumped on the opportunity to get out of the house. And then they regretted it. They ended up leaving. They just realized that, oh shit, this is a real war. NATO is inside Ukraine. Yeah, I mean, remember I asked one of our guests we had a couple of weeks ago, Scott Eulinger, who's the former CIA chief in Eastern Europe, and who knows the Russian military situation really well. He's aware of all the issues and dynamics around this particular combat. He's a military logistics specialist. He served in the military as well in the U.S. And I asked him how much stuff over there is falling under Title 50. In other words, CIA special military operations. And that was, he kind of said, well, it's not hard to imagine. So I think there's a lot more going on than meets the eye, but I don't know. In the fog of war, there are a lot of things that are slipping through the cracks and that we're not hearing about. And I don't know if there's an interest on the part of a lot of Western media outlets to talk about these things. Seems like if you go to CNN, for example, it's grotesque. Their front page. I mean, pick any point of the day and go to CNN.com, and it's just grotesque, spun, totally no effort to objectively cover the story. It's just Putin regime, Putin war crimes. I mean, I don't know. CNN is BS. One of the callers said, "Yeah, I mean, I have a lot of criticism. Somebody worked at the Fox News channel. I mean, without getting into too much of it, everybody knows some of the stories at Fox News, and that was the period. Yeah, there was a film made about it called Scandal, I think, or something. Forget. But anyway, it was a film with Charlize Theron and Nicole Kidman, and you could look it up. Fox News, Nicole Kidman, Charlize Theron. Margot Robbie is in it too. So I was there during that period. Enough said. But beyond that, I mean, I can talk about our editorial meetings, and there are times when it was right in the middle of the Iraq War, and I'd show up at the editorial meeting and say, I think we need to talk about what's happening on the ground in Iraq. And my colleagues were like, no, there's a great B-roll, so video of a bulldog on a skateboard, and we're going to do that. So there's just no interest to cover things in a way that they don't think people want covered. They're just giving people not really the news, but what they want people to think. They're doing so much mind manipulation and that's why people, if you talk to people in the States, whether it's, and even in Canada, North America has this problem in general, Europe a lot less. But in North America, you talk to somebody about COVID or about climate change or about Ukraine, and they have a very strong opinion with very little knowledge, elements of knowledge. And it's because they've just been given the narrative. Here it is, nicely packaged, with all of the buzzwords, the emotionally driven buzzwords, and they just, here it is. And the result of that is a lack of information. If you have more details and less conclusions, it's then it forces people to think a little bit more and to have a little bit more of a balanced point of view. So when you have somebody who's just spewing narrative and angry about any kind of contradictory facts that might call into question that narrative, it's because they haven't been given the information per se. They've been given the conclusion. Now, I have a comment up on the screen. I don't know how that got up there. U.S. does not see rehabilitation. I don't know. Is that what's coming next? I don't know. All I know is that I heard that the Greek parliament was not happy that Zelensky showed up with a couple of members of Azov to a speech he gave. I'm assuming it was remotely. I can't imagine he went to Greece. But apparently they weren't thrilled about that. But again, that's been buried. It came out here in Europe. But you really have to look for these things. We're talking about Fox News. Outfoxed is not a bad documentary. No, I'm talking about the movie I'm talking about that captures really the culture of Fox News when I worked there was the movie. It was a Hollywood movie. Um, I forget what it's called. Let me look it up because I'll give you the name and you can go watch it. Um, Kidman. Um, I thought it was Scandal, maybe Bombshell. Bombshell. That's the name of it. So if you watch that movie, I'm sure you can find it everywhere. It's on Netflix, I'm sure now by now. So all right. So my guest didn't show up today. Thank you so much, Xavier. I'll see if I can get him on for Thursday. I don't know where he took off to. I have um yeah, I have him. He never got back to me, so I don't know where he is. But that's okay. There's a lot to talk about. We'll be back tomorrow. And um I see all your comments here. I'm just trying to catch up. I'm glad you guys are having a good time in chat. I love reading your comments, by the way. Um, I'm going to be back tomorrow, the same time, same place. And tomorrow I'm going to have on Jack Devine, former director of operations of the CIA, to talk about Ukraine. The guy who introduced the Stinger missile to Afghanistan and ran that covert war against the Soviets. He's going to talk about Ukraine and the war against Russia. Okay. So that's tomorrow. Hopefully he'll show up and I'll find out what happened to my guest today. All right. It's been great. Once in a while, we'll be able to do a show like this. I also plan on having shows where we just talk about things in the news, but I actually have some video elements and we can like talk about like a classic stream, right? We can talk about things that the White House is saying or that some European leaders are saying or the head of the EU or whatever. And we'll be able to go through the news. All right. It was great having you guys all on here. Thank you so much for joining me. I'm Rachel Marsden. You can join me anytime, day, night. You can write me. You can check out my columns. You can rewatch this show. It's all at rachelmarsden.com. And we'll be back again tomorrow, same time, same place, with another guest and another show. All right. Have a good morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever you happen to be. And we'll see you again tomorrow. Bye.